This is a quick video designed to revisit some concepts from Chapter 3 using a problem similar to the ones we did in Chapter 9 as an example. So a few of the repeat challenges that I saw with students in the class is thinking about your base data and getting your spreadsheet organized in a certain way. So one of the things that is very helpful is to think about the layout of the spreadsheet on paper or in concept before you start on the sheet. So for example, if I started with the spreadsheet that's shown in front of me here, I have some base data that's in here. Okay? That base data is shaped like this. The units are organized vertically, so the array of cost per unit is vertical, the array of price per unit is vertical, the array of capacity per unit is vertical. If your data is already organized that way, it is not a great idea to then organize your decision matrix horizontally. It's much easier to keep your thoughts organized and your spreadsheet organized if your decision variables end up vertical as well. Okay? So in this case, we're imagining this is a problem that is saying to maximize the profit of this manufacturing company making these three products with these three costs, these three prices, these three capacities per unit, these 3 hours per unit. This is available hours to produce. This is the minimum stock. Okay, we're going to start just with those constraints, and we're going to come back for this other constraint. A few things you should keep in mind. So if I'm about to do some multiplication and things, and I want Solver to solve for a certain array of how many am I going to produce, I personally like to skip a column, or maybe two, and come over a little ways in case I realize I need to move some things around. So me personally, I'm going to pick this right here, and I'm going to claim that this is where I'm going to solve my problem. And I'm going to say that this is the quantity I'm going to produce of each. Okay? I know at the end I'm curious to know, me personally, I like having a sums column, sums row underneath my columns. So I'm kind of curious about that. And I know in a minute, after I multiply some things, I'm going to want to be able to compare the sum of the hours to this available hours. Okay? And I want to be able to compare the minimum stock per item that's already in this array. So let's think a little bit about the few things I need to understand from this. I potentially could just go rogue and open Solver and say, hey, I know that by, I didn't put a formula in there yet for profitability, but let's say that I already want to create a constraint or a cost or something. I could put formulas right here inside of Solver. It does work. It is not a good idea. Okay, so I'm going to close that. I know it has to be on the active sheet. So I'm going to get around to my profitability in a minute. So instead of building formulas inside of Solver that makes it hard to see what's happening, I'm going to say, what is my total cost to produce? My total cost to produce is clearly how many did I produce of this one times how many, what was the cost of that one? Okay, I could skip down and just do a sum product multiplying the two arrays together. That is possible. Okay, so you could go with this route. I'm going to put some dummy values in here because I'd like that. I'd like to be able to see if my spreadsheet is doing something. I can do this, and I can say that here's my costs per unit to produce. I could say that here's my price per unit to produce by doing the same multiplication. Okay, and then I could come over here and come up with my sums. So I have a sum. Okay, so I know what my total cost was and my total price was. It does also work for those of you who like to do it this way. I'm going to put it directly underneath it now that I think about it. I can do a sum product of array 1, comma, array 2. Come up with this. Array 1, comma, array 2. Okay, that does totally work. Okay, as you can see, I got the same result. Personally, for me, when I'm exploring new data for the very first time, if I'm not building a spreadsheet that's designed to be automated and used several times, I'm going to create a separate column for each one so I can see what's happening. Okay, as I've helped some students in the class that got stuck on a spreadsheet, it's because they nested too many ideas into a single formula and they could not see what was happening. It is important to understand that with a sum is the same as a sum product, because when we get into chapter 10, there are a few things that are just inconvenient without using sum product. Okay, so now I'm also going to do my hours the same way. I'm going to do both options, okay, just so you can see how it works again one more time. Whoops. this case, because I've copied my sum product over. There we go. Oops, these are not dollars. Format cells. It's just a number. Okay, so I've managed to get to that. Now I have my total cost, my total price, my total hours, and now that I know my total cost and my total price that's out there, I can come up with my total profitability, right? So I like to highlight the cell that I'm about to do that kind of work on so that I know that it's there. I'm a fan of these little arrows. Some people think I'm nuts, but I like the little arrow to go in there. And I'm going to say total profit is right there. And it is basically price minus cost. Beautiful. Okay. So in a minute, I'm going to want to compare my minimum stock and my total hours available. Well, I have a total hours here. Okay. I have a way to compare it. I have a way to compare the minimum production on each item. So I think I'm ready to open Solver and do this one. Now you can see the main point of doing this exercise is not to solve another problem for you guys. It's to talk through a little bit how I organize my thinking as I go through all this stuff. Okay. So now I'm going to go to Data, Solver. I need to optimize this one, boink, and I want to get the maximum I can get by changing variable cells. How much am I going to make of each, right? And I have some constraints. It's a best practice to put the calculation, the cell reference that includes calculations and results in this cell reference cell, and put the scalar numbers that you typed in as data in the constraint cell. You don't have to do it that way. But when it comes time to troubleshooting a larger spreadsheet, if you've been consistent of putting formulas in the cell reference and scalars in the constraints, it'll be much easier to find problems if you've made a mistake someplace on your sheet. So I'm going to use my sum product result here as my total hours. And I know my constraint is 2,000. I'm going to add another constraint here. Ooh, I'm going to actually hit OK. Let me go ahead and close this. I'm going to add one more formula first. So one of the things I saw happening in several people's sheets is if I knew my minimum stock was 100, I would compare each of these numbers one at a time to the minimum of 100. Well, I know that these are some of my sums. Okay. Well, I'm going to drop down. I'm going to drop down by 1 here and say that I've got a minimum. Okay. So I want to know what's the minimum production that I'm doing from each one of these items. So that's the minimum of each item, and I'm going to include that in the solver, not doing it one at a time. Okay. So I'm going to add the constraint. My cell reference, this minimum I just calculated, must be greater than or equal to 100. So we must at least reach 100 in each one of those items. Okay. So I believe that's the only two constraints we have right now. We want to solve this one, and let's see what happens. I'm going to keep the solver solution. Change my column widths here. So we can see the answers. And here we go. Here's what it comes up with for a solution. Okay. And you can see the minimum sometimes is slightly rounded. Don't let that alarm you. But that's how we come up with that. Now the other constraint that gave some people some challenges is if I add this additional constraint down here. I don't want the sales of product to be no more than 20% different, product 1, more than 20% different as compared to product 2. Okay? That may be because they are sets, that may be because I've got shared raw materials. Whatever the reason is, I want to keep those within 20%. Okay? Many folks, when you try to create this equation, you create an equation that said product 1 should be no more than 20% of product 2. That happened quite a bit. So instead, I'm going to say %diff of 1 to 2, okay? And I'm going to create a formula in here that does that. First, I'm going to do the total difference between product 1 and product 2, right? And I'm going to add an absolute value to it so that, because I don't care the directionality. So I know product 1 minus product 2, what's the absolute difference between those two is 1,400, okay? Now, I need to know what that percentage is as compared to product 2, okay? So the general diff, 1 to 2, and now my %diff, 1 to 2. All I have to do then is take this number and divide it by product 2. Okay, that gives you the percent difference, right? So right now I'm at 139% difference, which won't work. I don't care about any decimal places. I'm at 1400% difference. I know that that's going to force this model to have a completely different solution now that I've got that in there. Now there is the possibility that anytime you have division, it's going to cause a divide by 0 error. So in my case, I'm going to switch off and I'm going to include, I like to use the if is error formula frequently to do this. Okay, so I'm going to say if C20 divided by J13 gives me an error, I'm going to return the number 1 instead. In fact, you know what, I'm going to do something different because it would be silly. I'm going to have it return the value 1 million because that's completely out of scale for this spreadsheet, and it'll just tell me that, whoops, something went wrong. And then I'm going to do C20 divided by J13. Boink. So now I have a formula that protects me from a divide by 0 error. And if I go back to my solver again, I'm going to add this new constraint. Whoops, before I do that, I'm going to put a scalar in here. Percent diff max, 20%. That's all I'm going to allow, 20%. So one of the other things I saw as a habit for some folks when doing this equations, you were tempted to take your cell reference here, and it's less than or equal to, and put your 20% inside of solver. That does work, but again, this is more advice. When the spreadsheet gets large, you don't want any scalars like that buried inside of your equations or buried inside of your solver. As much as possible, put all of your factorials visible and then have equations pick them up from a visible cell. So instead of doing that, we're going to say must be less than or equal to this 20%. Click OK, and let's see if it solves. And we got a wildly different solution, right? So now that was different and it was in there. One final tip, same thing. I just mentioned it. If I know I've got a 20% that's going to be out here, I know I've got a 0.85 that I want to refer to, and I know I have a 133. I saw some folks that were tempted. If you were going to be doing something, you would say equals, and this is just a dummy example. Hey, I want to do this, and I'm going to do it times that 20%, and then I'm going to add this one times that 0.85. Oh, and then I'm going to add this one times my 133. I'm going to intentionally do the typo of not putting the 3 on, and here's my result. And I'm like, wow, that doesn't look right at all. It's very, very hard to find that in your spreadsheet afterwards. A better practice would have been to say that I was going to do this times this plus this times this plus this. Whoops. I accidentally finished the equation too soon. That times that. Boink. So there's the correct answer. And those of you who have been using the equation so far, you already know the fastest way to get there on this particular one would be to use that sum product. And I'm going to refer to these cells. I'm going to refer to these cells. Get that exact same answer. And very easy to troubleshoot. If the array is pointing to the right array, I can look at typos out here in the wide open very easily. This one is the hardest to troubleshoot, so I'm going to recommend you steer away from it. All right, there's a few tips for today. Hope that was helpful.